Four panelists, seated at a table on a stage in an auditorium. Behind them, a large screen reads, "The New York City Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and Art Beyond Sight present Project Access New York City, Best Practices for Inclusion in the Arts, Thursday, May 2nd, 2013, the Museum of Modern Art." The panelists in order of appearance are Jason Mischel, Deputy Commissioner of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, Joan Pursley of Art Beyond Sight, Tahra Grant, Senior Account Executive at Rubenstein Communications and an Art Beyond Sight board member, and Franklin Vagnone, Executive Director of the Historic House Trust of New York City.
Thanks, and thanks for coming. Like Victor said, I am Jason Mischel. I'm his Deputy Commissioner and General Counsel of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. Our panel today is called Reaching Art Patrons with Disabilities, which to me is pretty much the whole point of our sessions today. What we're trying to get across to cultural institutions is how they can open their doors to people with disabilities and not feel that it's going to be a heavy lift, that it's going to cost exorbitant amounts of money that might run your organization into the ground. We're talking about, in effect, providing reasonable accommodations. Before I get to reasonable accommodation, I just wanted to give you a quick stat as far as how many people with disabilities live in New York City. The best way to find that out is through something called the American Community Survey, which is sort of related to the U.S. Census. And in 2011, they put out estimates of a number of different breakdowns across different social characteristics. And according to their survey, presently there are 834,685 people with disabilities that live in New York City. When I started back in 2004, the numbers were actually higher than that. I tend to think that they are over 1 million. And that doesn't include visitors to the city. So you're talking about a huge market of people who live or visit here that want to take advantage of everything that the city has to offer. And having said that, not only is that an obvious incentive for cultural institutions to want to reach out to this community because of the sheer size of number, but another incentive is New York City itself. A couple weeks ago, I actually was in Rome, and then I went to Amsterdam, and I was actually shocked at how inaccessible those cities were. I was always under the impression, you hear things about, for instance, London having a fully accessible taxi fleet and things like that, and there's other global accessibility initiatives you hear about, but I think some of the realities on the ground are the fact that you have cities that are older cities that are just not accessible. When I was in Rome, the only thing that I found that stood out to me that was fully accessible was the Colosseum. They have a lift for wheelchair users. In Amsterdam, while it happens to be a beautiful city, it was disturbing. I went to the Anne Frank house, for instance, and there's just absolutely no way that at least people who use wheelchairs would be able to get in there. It seemed like that they did reach out to other disabilities such as deaf and hard of hearing and blind and low vision, but still, you want to cover everything. And my point being is that New York City is more accessible than you think. We do have older buildings, and it's certainly a job that's not done yet. But if you go to the Project Access New York website, what it does is they have cultural institutions that have signed up to promote the fact that they are accessible for people with disabilities in a wide array of disabilities. And that list is getting bigger, and that kind of represents competition to those cultural institutions that are in the city that might be lacking behind. I think that cultural institutions have to realize that in addition to the large population of people with disabilities that live here and visit here. There are also, there's the trend of accessibility from their fellow cultural institutions that are going to be taking those customers away from them if they don't start doing the right thing. So I'm trying to impart upon you that there's a lot of great benefits for reaching out to this population. Now to talk about a reasonable accommodation, I just wanted to read real quick. I know in the morning session we had a panel, the first panel was talking about a lot of the legalities behind providing access and referencing the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm not going to go over that ground. I just want to read to you quickly what the New York City human rights law has to say about what a reasonable accommodation is. It's basically defined as an accommodation that can be made that shall not cause undue hardship in the conduct of the covered entity's business. It leaves a really wide field of ways in order to provide accommodations. It's not just about, and I said this morning, but it bears repeating, it's not just about spending millions of dollars to make capital improvements to your buildings and being worried about that. There's all sorts of ways and means of accomplishing inclusiveness and accessibility that are very low cost, that are very efficient, and that will exponentially increase the amount of people that come to your institutions. I can give you one example that isn't really culturally related. Voting is an example where the law is that all polling places have to be accessible. But they don't, but the Department of Justice has put out a checklist to municipalities to show them how they can make these polling places accessible. And a lot of it has to do with, well, you can provide a portable ramp, or you can provide some sort of alternate location that might be nearby, or provide, let's say, transportation to a different space that might be more accessible. Or let's say having a drinking fountain that you take and you lower it so people can get to it. There's a laundry list of things that you can do. And my office, I'd like to describe it as a clearinghouse for reasonable accommodation solutions. So I would invite you, if you have further questions of solutions that you want to employ in your institution, do not hesitate to contact us. Victor mentioned the website before. It's nyc.gov/MOPD. You can also talk to me offline. But we're here for you to put aside your concerns about construction and major projects in order to create accessibility. There's things that can be done. The only other thing I want to say is that one of the things that I'm not going to say we have a problem with, but landmarks are kind of an issue, and I know that there's some crossover between landmarks and cultural institutions. As it stands, landmarks are more or less exempt from providing accessibility. What we try to do when we work with the Landmark Preservation Commission is just to talk to them about some of the things that I've already said, which is you might be exempt, but if you just bring in some programmatic solutions, you're going to find, in my opinion, and that people are not going to not come to your landmark because all of a sudden they see a portable ramp outside and they think that some sort of aesthetic was compromised. Life doesn't really work that way, and in fact, most of us who I guess you would consider able-bodied know people that are wheelchair users or deaf or hard of hearing or blind or low vision. And we're in the 21st century, and we understand that inclusiveness is only it can only benefit everybody. And the last final thing I'll say, and I'll turn it over to my fellow panel members, is There is one gray area which is a little bit difficult, which is the idea of a defense to providing accessibility that the ADA provides is something called fundamentally altering the nature of the service provided, which gets involved in cultural institutions because if you're thinking about art projects, such as, let's say, video art, where you want to provide captioning on that art, and then possibly the artist might have a problem with that because it's somehow fundamentally altering the nature of the art. Well, I'm always going to come down on the side of advocacy and the fact it's the right thing to do to make sure you get as many people in your institutions as possible. And there's ways around that. And like I said, if you come to us, we're more than happy to discuss ways with you that you can get this done, and we can meet with the artists, and we can meet with your superiors and yourselves, and we can come to solutions that are going to benefit everybody. So thanks for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Joan on my left from Art Beyond Sight.
Thank you. As Commissioner Khaleesi said, we worked with the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities to run a series of focus groups with adults with diverse disabilities in the summer, fall, and winter of 2012. And wonderful things came out of that, including lots of compliments for New York City or cultural organizations that have really exceptional programs, and a lot of just little practical ideas. We asked people to tell us about their attendance at zoos and aquariums, botanical gardens, theaters, dance, concerts, museums, sports arenas, and our group of several groups of people also told us they wanted to talk about films because they were avid movie goers, and these were particularly people with low vision. They said the first thing to do that would really help is if programs for people with disabilities are scheduled for times that are less crowded in your institutions, and also that let them avoid trying to travel through New York City during rush hour. There was a lot of talk about training staff, telephone staff that answer at your institutions and don't always know what's available or when things are, and front of house staff. They should know what's available. They should know if there's assisted listening devices in theaters, if there are audio guides, if there's ASL. They should also know when a performance or a program ends, because many people with disabilities rely on the assessor ride or a car service to pick them up, and if they don't know when that ends, they can't make those arrangements. Be sure your staff can give concise directions. We've been told time and again that over there is totally meaningless to someone who cannot see the gesture. And people want to know where the elevators are, where accessible bathrooms are, where the coat check is, where the cafeteria is, where the gift shop is, so they can also explore those areas. Make sure your information desk is wheelchair accessible. Have a pad and pencil there for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. You might also, if possible, ask an ASL interpreter to let you videotape on an iPad something that says, "We're very sorry, there's no one who knows ASL here right now, but there will be somebody at," and give the time, or "We have a special ASL tour on such and such day." We did, one of the focus groups we did had 4 people who were deaf who could not read, and they totally rely on ASL to communicate, and so they expressed incredible frustration when they go in and there's no one that they can talk to via ASL. You also should have large print and Braille. Large print is so easy to do now with your computer. And you can also, if you have Braille materials, that would be very helpful. If you can't Braille them in-house, the Lighthouse does Brailing for a very reasonable fee. Train staff on sighted guide technique. And I wrote down what one man said who was describing being taken to a seat. He said, "They grab you any old way and run with you, and you are dragging and bumping into everything, and they don't even see you. They are on a different path, and you are hitting all the obstacles. I think they need to be a little more educated and allow the disabled person to instruct them on how best to help. And this whole sighted guide technique was a big issue. A lot of people said, well, they grab my left arm, and that's the hand that I have my guide dog on, and then others said, well, whenever I go to a museum, if they don't know it, I try to teach them so that they'll know for the next person when they try to pull me with my arm. As sighted guide technique's very simple. The person who is blind or has low vision just takes your arm instead of you taking theirs, and they walk half a step behind you. If there is a narrow path coming up, you just put your arm behind your back, and they know, and then they move behind you. And, of course, you can alert them to steps or doors or special barriers. But it's not hard to learn. We have it on our website, www.artbeyonsight.org, and I'm sure it's on a number of other websites also. Websites, we talked about a little bit this morning, and signage are problems. I'll tell you a bad story about Art Beyond Sight. When I first started there, we were just building a new website, and our designer had our name in red on a blue background. And it was up, and we have our website tested by students at Perkins School for the Blind, and so we knew that all the tags were there and the screen readers worked and everything worked. And then we got an intern who was visually impaired, and he said, "Why isn't your name on your website?" And I go like, "What do you mean? Of course our name's on our website." He goes, no, it's not. And he said, "Look." And I said, "Well, Matt, it's there. It's in red. Don't you see it?" And he goes, "No, I can't. It's just all gray to me." Well, the colors were the same values, and he could not see our name. And too often, signage and labels, and particularly in museums where the curators want them to be very tasteful, are so subtle that it's very hard for anyone who has any kind of vision problems to read them. Their steps can be very difficult to see, and people at one of the discussion groups or one of the focus groups said, it's especially bad. It's one thing when there's a whole staircase and we can tell we're coming to a staircase, but when there are just a few steps when you're going from one space to another, particularly if they're light, we can't see them. And if someone could just put some tactile tape on them so that our cane can see them, maybe yellow tape so that people with low vision can also see them, it would really help. And it's horrible to go into a museum and have the first thing that happens is you fall down. We had people having difficulty finding accessible entrances and exits. They were usually told when they called to make an appointment where the accessible entrance was. But once they get into the museum itself, they sometimes get turned around and they can't find their way back. One man talked about the embarrassment he had when he went out. He finally found a ground floor door, and he went out and alarms went off and guards came, and it was a really bad moment for him. Aggressive elevator doors were mentioned. They suggested, and this probably costs a little bit, but they said if you could just have your elevator say door opening and door closing, and if you could have the timing for the doors adjusted just a little bit so they're longer. People with walkers, people who are blind, people with wheelchairs take a little longer to get on and off the elevator, and there's nothing worse than having your walker or cane stuck in closing doors. Movies. I told you people love to go to movies, and the people who were in our discussion group that identified themselves as blind said if they could have audio description of movies, it would really be meaningful to them and they would go more. And people with low vision said, "You know what we'd like, Joan? We'd like to have to be able to go to see the movie twice for one ticket. We really can't afford to buy 2 tickets for the theater, but the first time we watch a movie, we work so hard trying to understand and telling who's saying what, that we don't get any emotion from the film. And if we could just stay, maybe you could limit those tickets just to daytime on weekdays when the theaters are half empty anyway. But if we could stay and watch it a second time, then we could get the emotion of the piece." And I was so touched by that, because I thought how terrible to have to work so hard and you finally come out of the film you really, it wasn't uplifting or didn't mean much to you. Zoos and botanical gardens, the big problem that people raised with them was getting lost. They were very worried about getting lost. One man worried about falling into ponds in botanical gardens, but the rest of the people said no, no, no. But one man told me it took him an hour to find an exit when he had finished exploring the garden. He was so turned around, and he was with a group of other people who were blind, and they wandered around for an hour. And so I said, well, how can you solve that? And he said, well, two ways. First, he said the Brooklyn Botanical Garden has something that these people refer to as blind gardens, and that this morning the botanical person from the botanical gardens in the Bronx called a sensory garden. And they're smaller gardens, and they have herbs and other aromatic plants that have good scents, and people can also handle and feel the plants. And they said, you know, we get great joy from those multisensory experiences, so that would be great. And the other thing is, why can't they just put some seating areas in these botanical gardens? And when they do, if they could just put a tactile map and a large print map that has that you are here and here's the closest exit. He said, then we'd know as we wandered around trying to find out how to get out, that if we found a seating area, we could find a map, and the map would tell us how to leave the gardens. Makes sense, and like so many things you can do for people with disabilities, I think all of us would appreciate seating areas in botanical gardens. Performance, we had a lot of praise in several focus groups for Carnegie Hall, which I'm told their ushers and their staff all understand sighted guide technique, that if a group goes and they have to leave early and they tell the usher comes and tells them when it's time. Ushers have also helped people out of the Carnegie Hall and to the Accessivan out front. That's just made a huge difference in the people's experience. We also had a lot of praise for Broadway theaters, which we were told were very accommodating with accessible seating. However, some of the people with vision loss asked if some of the seats up front could be discounted for certain performances for people who are low vision or blind, that if they can't afford the really expensive tickets, but if they sit further back, they don't get anything out of the show because they can't see anybody on stage. We also had complaints from one group about headsets for audio description, and I don't know what theater they were at, but it was a small group, and they had paid $8 for headsets so that they could have an audio described performance, and they never could hear anything over the headsets. My last comment is, people said those of you who have good programs need to learn how to publicize them better. We had a lot of people talking about things they'd done, and other people in the group said, oh, wow, I wish I'd known about that. And that's what Tahra's going to talk about.
And I have a PowerPoint, so...
PowerPoint Slide 1. Title, The Price of Exclusion. Publicity and Marketing Campaign Considerations in Building and Maintaining Relationships with Individuals with Disabilities.
I think it's happening. Yes. Okay, so I'm here to provide some insight on how to effectively reach this largely untapped market once these accommodations that Joan was speaking to and more of these tactical initiatives are in place. Keeping in mind that your approach should remain as committed and ongoing and adaptable as you would with any market, addressing this broad community's needs and concerns and interests, again, as you would any.
Slide. Title, Recognizing Community as Global Markets. Point 1, Massive and Burgeoning Community with Burgeoning Purchasing Power. Point 2, Half the Planet, Not Just One Market.
So first, and you have a sense of this from earlier presentations, but it's important to understand and recognize the scale and the breadth of this community. I mean, there are over 57 million adults with some form of disability, and it's a largely untapped market, again, of people who command over $1 trillion in consolidated buying power and disposable income collectively. So we're talking about a massive and growing community, the largest minority group, in fact, in the world, even surpassing the Hispanic market. And more so than other markets, this includes not only individuals with disabilities themselves, but their significant others and their friends and their families, whose activities are to an extent guided by their companions' lifestyles. So once you account for all these added markets, you're looking at almost half the planet.
Slide. Title, Value to Your Business. Point 1, Viable Markets. Brand Loyalty. Point 2, Advantageous Position. Point 3, Important Cultural Statement.
And so with this in mind, I think this community should immediately become a crucial component in every marketing and public relations plan. I mean, you'd essentially be leaving money on the table. You'd be doing your institution a disservice not to recognize the value in connecting and not to recognize this community as a viable market niche. I think it's also worth noting that individuals with disabilities have proven to be incredibly brand loyal, especially to fully accessible businesses, which are unfortunately still in the minority. So here's an opportunity to uniquely position yourself and make a powerful cultural statement about inclusion and awareness.
Slide. Title, Press and Marketing Materials. A photograph showing a diverse corporate advertisement with 5 people, including a woman using a wheelchair. Point 1. Internet is key, the place of accommodation. Point 2. Exercise special care with language. Point 3. Leverage diversity of your consumer base. Point 4. Redefine disability.
And in generating materials, I think it's important to keep in mind, and Joan kind of touched on this a little, is that the internet is increasingly valuable, especially for people with disabilities, many of whom are not as mobile. So as the place of accommodation, the internet and your website provides you with added opportunity to expand your reach. Unfortunately, many businesses still struggle with accessible sites, and again, when text is obscure and sites are heavier on non-captioned images and Flash, your site immediately becomes exclusionary, and screen readers cannot be as effective in relaying information. And also, as you know, especially when working with markets within a minority group, paying special attention to preferred language becomes increasingly important. So, you know, people with disabilities should never be identified or defined by their disability. And in that same vein, words like special needs should be avoided, as it suggests there's a burdensome need there, when instead it's really our delivery and our accommodations that need to change to be fully inclusive and fully accessible. And as with all PR and marketing campaigns, you must leverage the diversity of your consumer base and your potential consumer base. So images and materials should be a reflection of your markets, and in this case, the images should serve to empower and redefine disability to represent qualities like inclusion and strength.
Slide. Title, Furthering Visibility. Point 1, Enlist in awards campaigns. Point 2, Align with disability organizations. Point 3, Regularly pitch listings on special opportunities for people with disabilities. Point 4, Demographics of your staff should be a true reflection of the diversity of your market.
And going beyond what is legally required, I think, makes a really powerful statement about your institution's core values. And I think it just sends a signal that you really get it. I find value in entering awards campaigns, once you're in a position to do so, of course, for added recognition and added exposure, especially within the communities of people with disabilities. For example, the Access Awards, Helen Keller Achievement Awards, Ruth Green Advocacy Award, etc. And I think it can also be helpful to connect with a national or local disability organization to see what opportunities there are for partnerships to generate added exposure and to capitalize on their platform and their existing consumer base and their networks. Art Beyond Sight, for example, and the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. And then pitching items and listings to the media on these special opportunities and special tours and special days for people with disabilities is invaluable, I think, and should take just as much priority as, you know, the other events you're doing year-round, because these opportunities are really, they're extremely valuable for individuals with disabilities who can find solace in not having to worry about accessibility that day. And I'm also going to use this opportunity to note the importance of ensuring that your team reflects the diversity of your markets, not only because of the value of having these firsthand contributions, but while unemployment amongst individuals with disabilities is high, statistically their turnover rate is actually low and they have higher rates of retention.
Slide. Title: Realities of the Market. The cover of a novel, No Pity, by Joseph Shapiro.
And while it's key to incorporate this community into campaigns, it's just as important to keep your finger on the pulse of the evolving needs and concerns of this global market as you would any. I wanted to just quickly share an anecdote from a book, No Pity, where author Joseph Shapiro dedicates a chapter to the demise of Everest and Jennings, the once leading wheelchair brand that was essentially overthrown by a new brand that entered the market. So quickie wheelchairs kind of came into play, and they were more nimble, and they used colors, and they were essentially just generally more in touch with the needs and the changing interests of this community, allowing for their ultimate hold on the market. And then lastly, I just wanted to end with a commercial that you may remember from the Super Bowl a few years ago, which generated an outpouring of support and meaningful dialogue, and even added revenue for Pepsi. And I think my AV guys have to press play on that.
On screen, a Pepsi TV commercial plays with no sound. The on-screen narrator and actors are all using American Sign Language. The narrator signs, "This commercial was created and performed by Enable, a network in PepsiCo which supports diversity and the inclusion of persons with different disabilities." In the commercial, two deaf men in a car are trying to find their friend's house on a street of dark houses. One finally blows the car's horn, and the lights go on in all houses but one. That's the one they know is the home of their deaf friend.
So I think it's important that this marketing team recognized the value of targeting and including people who are hard of hearing in their marketing plan and put substantial resources into exercising that core value. I mean, Super Bowl ads are not cheap, and I think they understood that you have to speak to everyone if you want to be heard. And in closing, I just think that what kind of began as sporadic pilot campaigns to target this demographic has now become or should become a vital part of every marketing NPR plan. And most of you already have a grasp on the tremendous opportunity with this underutilized market, and I just hope that this serves to re-emphasize the value in dedicating real time and real resources into this outreach. And that's all I have.
Excellent. I don't know if many of you were in the morning session, but I spoke about the Historic House Trust.
PowerPoint Slide 1 shows the logo of the Historic House Trust of New York City. Vagnone continues to show slides that feature photographs of historic houses, maps of their locations, and logos of partners in their activities.
And manage 23 historic house museums in New York City. So when I speak from the perspective of very small cultural organizations with very small budgets. I would say that one of the major things that we're doing right now, and I spoke about that briefly, is the Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums. And that's a real in-depth reassessment of what it means to be a historic house museum as a cultural institution in New York City, realizing that on one end of the spectrum we have physical disability, and on the other end we have cognitive disability, and how historic house museums have traditionally been difficult to access on almost all of those levels. And I would just say that probably the number one thing, and I'll just piggyback on what you had to say, is we're not reinventing the wheel. We're going to organizations that already know what's best. how to target this market, what we should do, how we should make ourselves a better, more welcoming place. So at one level, a small cultural may seem that we only have 2 people on our staff and we don't have large budgets. Well, guess what? There are other nonprofit organizations out there who would love to work with us, and they can bring just tons of information, just as you were presenting and that you were talking about, that we really don't have to spend years trying to consolidate that.
Slide. Title: Peer Best Practices. Under a photograph of the Historic House Trust discussion page on the LinkedIn website.
One thing that we're doing is not only are we asking nonprofits that specialize in this information, we're also going to peer discussions and peer conversations. In this case, Historic House Museums. On LinkedIn, we have a rather large discussion group where we're talking about issues of disability and access and special notions of tactility and things that we can do to kind of systematically change what it means to visit a historic house museum. So not only are we asking nonprofits that specialize in those issues, but we're asking professionals who, by and large, are somewhat frustrated and wanting information.
Slide. Photograph showing pages from the New York Beyond Sight website.
And so one of the first steps was working with Art Beyond Sight. As I said, we have 23 historic house museum sites. The first thing that we've done is we've partnered with Art Beyond Sight, New York Beyond Sight, in having verbal descriptions of all of our sites, and they're all online. And this really established a partnership. We also have a partnership with the New York Department of Education with Respect for All. And not only is this an anti-bullying campaign, this is also a campaign that heightens respect for all types of, in this case, students, and it includes disabilities.
Slide. Title: Partnerships. With a list of organizations the Historic House Trust partners with.
So all of our houses have special programming for that week that deal with not only anti-bullying, but anti-bullying with people against people with disabilities. So again, these are 2 examples of partnering with other organizations where we don't have to do the heavy lifting. We can bring to it what we have. And then a simple issue is our website. We've had quite a bit of discussion about websites. I happen to be dyslexic, and if you've noticed this morning and this afternoon, I don't really have notes to speak, and that's primarily because I'm visual, and this is my note-taking, so my note cards are the slides. And we're also looking into typology and font that may make our website not only in terms of contrast with colors, but also the font itself would be readable. One thing we're realizing, and I know personally, is a great deal of information just kind of gets jumbled together. And so those are just a few of the more simple things. As I said this morning, our house museums, their budgets could range anywhere from, $40,000 to $100,000. And so the staffs may be 2 people. So what we want to do is provide these issues of accessibility and marketability and access for all in ways that don't just totally absorb the budget, because I know for a fact that all of our house museums want to be as inclusive as possible. They're just afraid of what that may mean in terms of budget and in terms of manpower. Thank you.